We're still recapping Watches and Wonders. Tons of new watches released, and I've spoken about Rolex already. This time it's about little baby brother, Tudor. Let's start with part one, the watches. A new, updated Black Bay. When Tudor relaunched one of their very first watches and the very first Black Bay, it was the Black Bay in Burgundy. This year we get version 3 of the Black Bay in Burgundy. There are some notable changes. 1. The movement is now META certified, so far better and more accurate. 2. The design has been tweaked with a crown that sits more flush with the case, lollipop instead of snowflake hands, and a thinner case by about 1 mm. Additionally, you get some other refinements on the case, the bezel, plus the option for a 5-link Jubilee style bracelet as well. Overall, these are all refinements which I think are improvements on an already very strong watch. In particular, the lollipop seconds hands and the thinner case profile are the improvements I'm most impressed with. There's not necessarily anything new here. It's refinement and adjustment, but they are good ones. A new Black Bay 54. This is a 37mm version of the Black Bay 58, but not identical. It's not just a shrunk down version. There are clearly differences which have been made to make it more wearable as a 37mm watch, including some of the aesthetics. This is cool. Overall though, this watch continues the trend of watches getting smaller and smaller. It's funny to think that way back in the 2000s, it was perfectly normal to wear a 45 to 49mm watch, and now we're here, a 37mm watch. It's hard not to like this watch, since it looks a lot like the other Black Bays, with some notable differences. Having said that, 37mm is likely something that I will feel too small with my almost 7.5-inch wrist. I'll probably be in the minority, but I'll get back to that. The Black Bays with no bezel have also been updated. This is basically, again, a question of updating all the non-bezel Black Bays, primarily cosmetics and technical updates and new bracelet. Again, this is a trend of refinement and improvement. Finally, we get a new GMT with an opaline dial and otherwise the same as the original GMT, which I love, which I own, and which I did a video on very recently. The thing to keep in mind with this watch in comparison with the other releases is that this watch has not received a slim down, a redesigned case profile, a crown change or otherwise. So if you thought the old GMT was too big and slab-sided, well, you're going to think the same thing here. My guess though is that eventually the refinements that are rolling into the Black Bay line will eventually get all the way into all the other lines, including the Black Bay GMT. Then they also did some updates to the Royal line. I still don't really get excited about the Royal line. I know that the bezel has a lot of historical significance, but I just don't particularly care that much for it. And overall, I still feel that the dress or classic watches are Tudor's weakest link. This leads me to my thoughts about Tudor and some topics more generally. Sizing. Back in the mid-2000s, Panerai was king. Breitling also made behemoth watches, as did many others. Size was in, and it was our collective fascination. Today, we have largely come to see that period as unsightly, ugly, and, well, hideous even. We've seen a continuing trend towards smaller and smaller watches, going from 49mm behemoths, like I said, to 42mm, and right now 38 to 40mm are, the most common range. Tudor has now released a Black Bay 54 in 37mm, which is not just marketed as a woman's watch. It's unisex and aimed at everybody. And I'm just starting to think, is there a lower limit where the tide turns and we all realize that watches suddenly have become too small? Now, I know a guy like Christian from Theo and Harris will probably say, well, in the 50s, watches with 34mm or 33. But the average Western individual, and probably all around the world, is about half a foot taller and 20 to 30 pounds heavier than the average 1950s person. The average American today is close to 200 pounds and 5'9" and has a 7.25-inch wrist. Rolex has stayed in the 40 to 42, maybe 38, 39mm space for a very long time. And I wonder if Tudor is one of the first manufacturers that's reaching the lower limit of what we'll find acceptable. Now, just to point out, I absolutely think that the BB54 is going to be hugely popular. I think a lot of people are going to appreciate the 37mm. So I'm not questioning the size in itself of the individual watch, but the overall trend that talks to just watches getting smaller and smaller and smaller. To me, size is not an objective aesthetic. There is not a right size. Otherwise, why were the pop watches in the 2000s at 45, 46, 47mm viewed as aesthetically good looking? Because they were. Much like skinny jeans on men in the mid-2000s in Sweden were all the rage, and bell-bottom trousers were all the rage in the 1970s. There is a subjective and fashion-based component to watch size. And I'm just curious as to when will we reach the lower limit where somebody looks at their watch and says, wow, they really got small. Too small, actually. Let's grow them in the other direction and you'll see a trend in the other direction. Or am I wrong? Is it just going to continue until we hit a natural limit and then it hits to 34 and just stays there forever? Let me know in the comments. Tudor's growing up. I know. Tudor has been around for a very long time, but the reality is that prior to their relaunch in the US market a little over a decade ago, Tudor were a nowhere brand and a nobody brand. They had a huge task of rebuilding their brand and finding a place in the market. They did that by doing essentially two things. One, they positioned themselves in the market as the bad boy, the up-and-comer, the daring upstart, trying to shake up the industry. Secondly, and most importantly, they released some really good watches. This was not just a marketing stunt. They well and truly have been on an incredible run of releasing incredibly good-looking and very popular on-trend watches. Their lineup can get a little bit confusing because everything is the Black Bay, but that's a minor thing. They're almost all universally good watches. Some people might think they're slab-sided, but they're fixing that now. And now we get to 2023. We've come full circle. The first Black Bay, the full-size model, is out now in its third iteration with refinements. Movement improvements, slimming down of the cases, aesthetic adjustments of their first Black Bay, which in all likelihood is going to set the tone for the coming years where they slowly but surely go through updating all the lines in a semi-routine cycle. I'm reminded of the old Intel cycle for CPUs of ticks and tocks, where 1 year went to updating the core architecture and 1 year went for efficiency refinements. Innovation, tick, refinement, tock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. As far as I can tell, Tudor is no longer in the stage of bringing really new things to the table every single year. They have a fairly strong lineup, the Black Bay and the Pelagos lineup, and now it's about adjusting them, refining and fixing. I'm not saying that they'll never come out with anything new anymore. Of course they will, but they're shifting gear over to a more settled pace where it's about maintaining position rather than finding its position. Bearing this in mind, and I repeat of course that they will still do new stuff, I think Tudor is officially going to be going into the boring phase. Refinements will include what we perceive as improvements, but consider the difference between releasing a whole new Black Bay all those years ago and now just changing the aspects on that very same Black Bay. They're improvements, we can like them, we can discuss them. There's a lot of value in discussing them. The discussions are going to look a lot more like the Rolex discussions. Not so much, ooh, this is a new watch, how cool is that? Most of the discussions around Rolex are, is this Explorer better than the old Explorer? Which is not a newness conversation, it's a refinement conversation. We're going to be seeing more of that with Tudor. We're going to be discussing details, not a new watch. Still interesting, but to many it will feel boring. Their manufacturing. Small side rant. I dislike the commercial that they released together with the Watches and Wonders watches. One, the video is patronizing. It talks to me like I'm stupid and it feels like an infomercial. It's trying to be hip and speak to the modern audience and to be relevant, so you have to say tech as if you're Apple or Google. Now, to be fair, I do think there is a place for this messaging because for the most part, watch manufacturers are usually filmed as videos of old farts with monocles in white lab coats handling things with tweezers. The usual way these brands brand themselves is stuffy and aged, but replacing with a tech vibe is not my cup of tea. Secondly, I don't necessarily think it's a strength that they're leading so hard into the fact that they're basically building everything with machines. Yes, of course, people are involved, but after the video I was left with the feeling that Tudor is going to be making incredibly accurate, completely machine-produced chunks of metal, gears and glass with no soul. There is something about selling the value of hand labor to youth as well. Leading so hard into we have a machine to do it is off to me. Now, with my little rant put aside, ultimately, the video and the manufacturer speaks again to how Tudor is growing up, but also how they're focusing on mass production, quality and consistency of product. It's a thing for them now. They've had their quality issues in many ways, and the manufacturer speaks to how they are moving to refine and focus and strengthening the internal side of their organization. Tick, build new business. Tock, refine and improve production. Tick, tock. Innovation, starvation. I'm not sure if it's innovation or creativity, but it seems clear to me that Tudor is in some ways in a creative rut, possibly by choice, TikTok. Tudor has their Black Bays in a million alternatives, colors and sizes. They also have the other diver in the Pelagos, similarly in some shapes and sizes, but they haven't succeeded in coming up with something surprising for a while. Yes, this year or next year we'll get a new Black Bay chrono or a heritage chrono, likely thinner, better movement, better proportion, but for now, not dazzling, not surprising. Their slogan is born to dare, but I don't think right now that they are. It's not a problem for them because right now what they have is very, very good, but they need to focus a little bit on newness, the next eye catcher and not just the update. Otherwise they'll be in trouble when the TOC phase ends and the tick phase begins. Personally, I would like to see a true modern heritage chrono. I would like to see a Tudor Submariner, which would be cool, but will never happen. Something like the mid-90s chronos would also be cool. And finally, yeah, bring back the North flag. But yeah, right now it's about refinements, not creativity. And I just hope they have an eye on creativity as well going forward. And creativity broader than just making smaller adjustments to improve on a watch and make them more updated to the time we live in. Essentially, I'm saying to them, don't end up too much like Rolex, but come up with something new every now and again and not as slowly as Rolex does. So those were my thoughts about Tudor. Good movement updates, thinner is better, nicer dials, incremental changes on many models, most of which seem to be good changes. I'm not sure about the more groupy bezel on the Black Bay, but overall good refinements. I'm not a big fan of the Opaline GMT. I think a lot of people will be, apart from the size and still the thick case. The 37mm Black Bay 54 is probably going to be a smash hit, but I'm guessing it's too small for me. Overall, this is the year where Tudor grew up. Hopefully they still have an eye on coming up with new things and not just refinements, because otherwise we're going to say they're going to be just as boring as Rolex in the future. Having said that, tell me what you think in the comments below. Comment, like, subscribe. Cheers.